everyone. So today we're looking at urban patterns and development. This is Unit 6, Part 4, Challenges to Urban Areas. Okay, so in your notes, I want you to take a moment and brainstorm out what are some challenges that the city of Seattle faces, or if you live somewhere else, somewhere that a city close to you, what are some challenges that they face? And what are some ways that the city can respond to those problems? So what can they do about it? Our objective today is to explain the way that demographic changes and migration influence challenges for cities. And our tidbit of the day is that Rio de Janeiro has a population density of 12,382 persons per square mile. So it is very, very dense. It's a lot of people per square mile. Okay, so some challenges to cities. There is a concept called Brochures Ethics, and this talks about American urbanization and how it's changed over time. And in this case, it's changed because of transportation changes. So cities get bigger, they grow, they develop, they happen as transportation changes over time. So we start first with sailing and with wagons, and cities are basically where you can access them with a sailboat or where you can access them with wagons. And this is going to put a severe limit on the number of cities and the size of cities, because if it needs to be somewhere where you can reach it with a sailboat, it's going to be very limited to being on fairly deep water. If you can access it by a wagon, there's only so much that you can carry in a wagon, so it's going to be pretty arduous to get there. It's going to be very expensive to transport pricier or fragile or spoilable, perishable goods. So cities are going to stay fairly limited. And this is going to take place from about 1790 into 1830. Remember, it's 1790 because we are specifically talking about the United States here. The second one is the Iron Horse epoch, and this is 1830 to 1870. Anytime we're talking about the Iron Horse, we're talking about trains. We're talking about steam engines. Big, old-fashioned, running on steam, move way, way faster than a sailboat or a wagon, still fairly slow by today's measures, but a huge upgrade from sailboats and wagons. So they call them iron horses. They are huge. They are literally made out of iron. They have immense pulling capacity or carrying capacity like a horse, except for obviously drastically exponential because we are talking about a train. From the 1870s to the 1920s, backtracking on, with that Iron Horse epoch, we're going to see cities expanding westward. We're going to see an increase in the size of cities. We'll start having things like cattle brought from the Midwest and the Southwest to cities like Chicago and being transported farther, so the cities are better connected to each other. They can transport more goods, they can transport more people between them. We're going to see their sizes growing because now we're going to have to meet up with the trains. We have people working on the trains, and we have people working in some type of transportation to move things. So our cities are going to get way bigger, and we're going to start expanding farther and further westward in the United States. Next up, we get the steel train or steel rail epoch, and that's 1870 to 1920. So we move from the steam engines to now steel rails. This is still kind of holding true to that same type of concept, but they're faster, they're more efficient, they are more technologically advanced, and we're going to see more people traveling in addition to goods. And this, again, still going to increase the size of our cities. It's going to increase the number of cities, because over this time, they're just getting more and more connected. We're putting rail lines down between more cities. There are more stops along the way. Sometimes where you have a small stop, a city will grow up around it because it's close to a way that you can get stuff and close to a way that you can send stuff. From 1920 to 1970, we are going to move into the auto air amenity epoch. And this is cars and planes. Okay? So cars, you're going to start having more individuals who can travel between cities. And this is, as we know, going to be the era in which we see towards the latter part of it, the rise of the suburbs. Airlines, they're going to start off kind of slow, but pretty quickly they'll be able to move. They'll be able to, again, we're growing cities. People are living farther outside of them. We're more quickly able to transport goods and people between them. And then finally, we're going to get to the high technology epoch. And this is the 1970s until now. And we have faster and larger cars. We have better large transportation like buses and things. We have passenger airplanes or very large planes in general. We have jets of all sorts. We have rockets. We have all kinds of things. We have satellites. We have all these ways that urbanization is changing because of technology. Okay. So again, this is just kind of going through everything that I just said. Cities are growing near ports and major waterways. In the start, Iron Horse, steam technology, steamboats, regional railroad networks, steel rail, national railroad, that's going to be a huge deal. Auto air amenity, gasoline combustion engines, more reliable, faster, more powerful. Cars are becoming fairly commonplace, and eventually everybody will have them. Relatively speaking, obviously not everybody. And then finally, our last one that's continuing to go on and continuing to grow and develop. Okay. In your notes, I want you to take a moment to define two terms, and we have talked about these terms a couple of different times in the past. So define white flight and ethnic neighborhood. So with the deterioration in urban areas, one of the things that's going to cause this is a process called redlining. And again, we've talked about redlining. And this is where banks draw lines on a map to show where they won't lend money. And basically, the overall concept comes down to they won't lend money to poor people. They won't lend money to particular neighborhoods. And often what we see with that is that these neighborhoods are occupied by people of color. So it becomes very much de facto segregation and very much de facto structural racism. And this is technically illegal, but it does happen. Second thing we're looking at here is something called public housing. So this is housing for low-income households. It is subsidized by the government. We talked about with subsidizing with agriculture, so the government will pay farmers in part for what they're growing. In this part, they're paying a part of housing so that people who don't have a lot of money can afford somewhere to live. So it's subsidized housing. However, nice concept in general, but it tends to be very unsafe. This is also, if we hear the term the projects or ghetto, or when we start getting down into the other terms with it, barrio or Chinatown, these are places that are often ignored by law enforcement. Crime is often flourishing here. They typically are not well funded, so low taxes mean that all of the infrastructure is not up to date. It's not great, and by great I mean it's pretty awful. They are essentially just entirely ignored. And make sure you check out the videos in Google Classroom because I have some linked in here that's directly relating to this. This is what we would often call in other areas slums. And when you have all of these things building up, more services are going to move out of these areas because people can't afford things, but because the services are moving out, now people don't have places to work, and because people don't have places to work, now they have to find other ways of making money, and that's where we see this rise in crime. All of this stuff builds up on itself. Education tends to be pretty poor in these areas. A lot of times schools have very high turnover rates for teachers, meaning that teachers are leaving after only a year or two, or even less at times. Kids are unable to go to school. A lot of families are unable to get adequate food for their children and themselves because there aren't grocery stores nearby, because grocery stores don't want to be there because it's unsafe. And with all of these things, they all just compound on top of each other, so that they don't want to be there because the businesses don't want to be there because crime rates are high, but crime rates are high because there's nowhere to work, because the businesses have left. So everything just builds up. And again, ethnic neighborhoods, we would often see these in Chinatown, in ghettos, in barrios, all of the terms we have for generally where people of color are living. Okay. So if we look at this map in New York, we can see the various areas and the predominant races or ethnicities by tract. So we're talking census tracts. And notice that they typically are going, like, races are typically going to be near each other. Obviously, we're looking at predominant ones, so it's hard to see if there are multiple living there. But where we have Black, we're going to often have Black African American, then we'll also often right next to it have a Black Afro-Cuban, or we might have Hispanic Dominican, or Hispanic, basically everybody else, as this one qualifies it. You could also have Hispanic Puerto Rican. So they all typically stay close to each other. Asians of various ethnicities are going to typically live near other Asians of various ethnicities. But it maintains segregation, and this again is what we call de facto segregation. It's not technically the law of the land, but it's what happens. It's essentially by fact. Okay. And here, and I know this is blurry and hard to see, but this is median household income. So the blue is up to $25,000, which is pretty low. The teal is $25,000 to $35,000. The darkest green is $35,000 to $45,000. The medium green is $45,000 to $70,000, and then the yellowy green is greater than $70,000. And we can see how concentrated these groups are next to each other. It's a little bit weird when we get kind of in right along the part by the river where we have more than 70,000, pretty near that 25 to 30,000. But for the most part, everybody kind of sticks to themselves. So I'm going to put this in the Heights video. I'm going to link this in the description. This is Lin Manuel Miranda, and you guys might know him from Hamilton, but his first really big deal musical is called In the Heights, and it was about living in an ethnic neighborhood. It was about living in public housing, a public housing neighborhood in New York, and he based it on experience. So take some time and watch that. It's really, really good, very highly acclaimed, excellent stuff. Okay, so then we get into squatter settlements. Squatter settlements are informal communities that don't have a legal tie to the land, and they are without services. In Brazil, we call these favelas. In big cities overall, in mega cities particularly, we typically have huge squatter settlements. So we have Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, Mexico City, Bangkok, Cairo, Lagos, Mumbai. These are places with absolutely enormous squatter settlements, and they typically are going to be essentially right next to wealthier areas. People build up where they can, they live where they can, they build the housing that they can, and it typically is very, very unsafe. It's very ramshackle, it's thrown together, it's pieces of corrugated steel and maybe like curtains and things. You have all kinds of stuff, and we'll look at some photos and stuff. Again, there's videos of this in Google Classroom, so make sure you check those out. But where we have high wealth, we're also going to have very high poverty, very extreme poverty. And this is in Brazil. So look at how closely these houses are, how close this housing is all together, how run down it looks, how densely populated this is. They're not going to have a lot of access to basic necessities, to running water, to electricity, to plumbing, any of that stuff. So they tend to be very dirty, very unhygienic, and people are unable to access the basic stuff that they need. So they are struggling a lot. We're talking about people who are already struggling, and that's why they're in squatter settlements, and then they're going to further struggle within those communities. Again, imagine living with all of this around you. Notice all of the little pieces of garbage, the shoes, the boxes. Imagine this is your home. You have heavily armed soldiers or police that walk up and down the streets, because this is the reality for millions of people across the world. This is the reality for a lot of people, even in the United States, that they might look at something, they might come across people in the US who are dressed like this, who are ready to shoot like this, and living in these areas where they have just this immense level of garbage and refuse on the streets. They're very, very dangerous, very unsanitary, all that stuff. Okay, so I want you to take a moment and discuss in your notes what can and should cities do about massive squatter settlements. So I want you to really think about the positives and negatives of doing something about them and what might be done. But they typically, again, we're talking unsafe, we're talking lacking basic necessities. Imagine if you had to live your life without running water or electricity. We've all lost power at some point, and it's really inconvenient. Imagine that all the time. How do you cook your food? What do you eat? How do you wash your hands? How do you go to the bathroom? Those basic things that are just part of human life and that we absolutely need for that. So think about what can and should cities do about these squatter settlements. Okay. So then we're going to get into zoning, and we've talked about this a little bit in class, but a city designates land for different purposes, such as residence and business and manufacturing. You can't build your house, generally speaking, next to a manufacturing zone. You can't build your house next to Walmart. Sometimes these things coexist, but usually that's because they were already, the businesses or something like that came after the housing. So the housing had essentially rights to be there. But apart from that, typically the areas are zoned completely different, and so they're unable to coexist. You wouldn't build housing where they have manufacturing going on, for example. And if we look here, we look at this map of Franklin County, or the borough of Mercersburg in Pennsylvania, and every single one of these colors stands for a particular type of zoning. So we have single-family residential, town residential, academic district, all this other stuff, and they all have really specific areas where they are allowed to be. So we've all probably heard the term gentrification, and we hear it used in different ways. And sometimes it's a little bit confusing as to whether it's a positive or a negative thing. But generally speaking, what we look at is that there are two terms that we kind of think about the same concept overall of gentrification, and one is more positive, one is more negative. So we're going to start with a negative one first, and that's actually that term, gentrification. This is the process where middle-class people typically, move into inner city neighborhoods and they renovate. So the big things to note with this one is that typically middle-class white people, people who have some money to spare but not tons and tons, so they're moving into these inner city neighborhoods where the costs are very, very low, because they typically are run down, often occupied by people of color who have lived there for generations. And the middle class people will come in, buy everything up really cheap, renovate it, and make it like this new exclusive, highly desirable neighborhood, which ultimately will price out the people who are already living there and force them to go somewhere else, find some new place. This is the kind of concept we think about where they put in like Whole Foods and expensive coffee shops and restaurants and all kinds of things. And it might make a desirable neighborhood, but it's pushing the people who were already there out, and often they don't have anywhere to go. So they've been there for generations. Maybe their parents or their grandparents or their great-grandparents lived there, and moving is expensive. It's hard to leave. Where do they live? Where do they work? Where do they do anything? So we typically, if we talk about gentrification, it has a very negative connotation. The other part of that we often would see as a little bit more positive is going to be something called urban renewal. So this is clearing and redevelopment of urban slums. And usually this is going to be more in line with doing things for the people who are already living there, fixing up areas and providing services for the people who are already there without displacing them, without making it more expensive, just making it cleaner, making it nicer, making it more livable. So I want you to take a few minutes, and again, in your notes, write out some pros and cons of gentrification. And you can use either of the terms. I might put next to them, like in parentheses, a G or a UR if it really hits more one than the other. And what do you think the people who already live there think? Do they want it? Do they want again, it's often white people coming in to neighborhoods where we have high levels of people of color, or high density populations. And we could look at this as kind of that white savior complex. So white people coming in to clear out and clean up and make a nice, maybe for themselves, the neighborhoods, or maybe doing it for the people who live there, when often it was policies by white people who made those neighborhoods fall into disrepair to start with. And I know this one's a little hard to read, so I'm going to read it out, but it says, gentrification, the process by which middle-class people take up residence in a traditionally working-class area of the city, changing the character of the area. Think of character here as interchangeable with culture, and what that would mean if that was your neighborhood. If you lived there and someone changed the culture of your neighborhood, changed your culture. The underclass is the inner city residents trapped in a cycle of economic and social problems. We might see them in other areas as well, but typically we're going to talk about underclass being in cities. They are often going to have very poor access to public health services, so public services, so health services, education, police. It's either inferior or there's very, very little access, or both. If you have no education, there's very, very little to no opportunity to have good jobs. If you don't have good jobs, you don't make money. If you don't make money, crime becomes more appealing. And this is that cycle that I was talking about before with the slums and squatter settlements. It just makes this cycle. And when we have crime, we're going to have poor public services, and the cycle begins again. So some economic consequences here. We have an eroding tax base, meaning our tax base is being washed away and shrunk down over time. These are low-income areas, so we are going to get fewer tax dollars. With fewer tax dollars, we reduce services. So we raise tax revenue by attracting businesses with subsidies, like you might invite them in with gentrification, or gentrification gets invited in, and this is potentially going to force poor people to leave. So it either, again, continues the cycle or it attracts gentrification. So I want you to take a moment and discuss in your notes to help break the cycle of poverty, you need to increase the number and quality of services in the inner city. But this costs money. So what do you think that we should do as a city, as a country, as a human population? What should we do about this? And take some time to really brainstorm that and make some notes. Okay. All right, new urbanism. So this is a planning and development approach based on the principles of how cities and towns had been built for the last several centuries. So we have walkable blocks, meaning that it's really easy to walk to places, sidewalks and everything. It's safe, it's not too far. Walkable blocks and streets, sorry. Housing and shopping are in close proximity. So you never have to travel really far to go do your grocery shopping or whatever kind of shopping you need to do. And public spaces are very accessible. This is the concept of new urbanism. So some of the goals of new urbanism are the goals of new urbanism. Walkability, connectivity. We want to be able to literally connect with other parts of cities, with our own communities. We could talk a little bit more existential about like communication, connectivity, and internet access and all of those things, but general just being connected. Mixed use buildings, so it could be shops on the main floor, housing in upper stories. We could have offices in there, whatever. We'd have a diversity of people, so age, income, and culture. We'd have quality architecture, stuff that's not going to break down soon. It's going to last a long time. Very stable. We'd have traditional neighborhood structures. So housing, the stuff that you want in your neighborhood, like restaurants, grocery stores, schools, things like that. The things that we need and want nearby. Increased density, so we are condensing where people live and making it all of the other things that we just talked about. Also, even making it more sustainable from an economic and an environmental perspective. And aligned with that, green transportation. So could be things like bikes, it could be public transportation that's going to be less polluting than a whole bunch of cars. It could be hybrid or electric transportation, anything like that. And then overall sustainability. And again, this hits from all sides. It's culturally sustainable, it's economically sustainable, it's environmentally sustainable. Okay, so I know that was a little bit of a long one, but let's look at our summary. So we want to describe the challenges faced by cities, and sorry, that should say faced. We want to identify problems that face cities in LDCs or MDCs, because we have a little bit of a difference, but definitely some crossover between the two. We want to explain the way that demographic changes and migration influence challenges for cities. So when we have more people migrating in or out, what is that going to do? Where are people going to go? Where are services going to go? And when we have a higher or lower age structure, do we have more young people or more old people? Are we more groups of color? Are we more poor or more wealthy? How do all of those things influence challenges for cities? Okay. And I will post this video in the description box. And that is it for today. So make sure that you go back, rewatch anything that you missed, check out the supplementary videos in the description, and read in your text, work on your critical thinking, and have a great day. Bye.